Right, Joseph, another book, one of many that you've produced, this one called Unforgettable. Give us a quick synopsis of what you're trying to achieve with it.
It was just some moments in New Zealand sport which are never to be forgotten, really. Not all good moments either. There's 160 sort of mini chapters in the book, and about 120 are great, gold medal triumphs and that sort of thing. And 40 are not so great, but for different reasons will never be forgotten. I mean, we had one at the end of last year with the America's Cup team leading 8-1 and losing the America's Cup final. An unforgettable moment, although not a good one.
Right, I picked out just a handful just to tease people, and the one I leapt to mind was Keith Murdoch's banishment in 72. We've seen Ian Kirkpatrick recently. Still, it hurts him. He was the captain 40 years ago.
Yeah, I spoke to Kirky not too long ago. He's still kicking himself for the way he handled that. He feels that he was not at his best as a captain at that time. He felt that Murdoch should never have been allowed to go home, and he should have put his foot down and said, if he goes, we all go, and brought that issue to a head instead of being steamrolled like he was.
Do you think today's setup would have handled it differently?
Totally differently. Murdoch wouldn't have been sent home. He wouldn't have spent the next 4 decades hiding out in the bush in Australia. It's terrible what's happened to that guy, and it definitely would have been handled differently now.
Manchester United were out here in 1967. George Best, the very best names amongst them.
They had, I think, 13 international footballers in that team, including some real rock stars, Nobby style, as you say, George Best and so on. And they didn't do too badly in New Zealand. They beat Auckland 8-1. Mark Burgess scored the goal for Auckland. And then they played New Zealand in Christchurch on a freezing cold night down there at English Park and beat them 11-0. 11-0, that's the New Zealand team being beaten by a club team. It became farcical, and it was so cold that the New Zealand team, everyone wore 2 jerseys, and then the New Zealand goalie was getting very hot because he was so busy. He was trying to take one of the jerseys off, but because he had 2 and they got stuck over his head, and while they were stuck over his head, Manchester United scored a goal. So yeah, it was a game not to be forgotten.
Not televised, fortunately. It'll be on YouTube for many years to come today. I picked out another quirky moment, a rugby league loss in 1963.
Yes, a very good New Zealand team, a lot of stars of those times, very good players. They lost to South Africa 4-3 in the mud at Carlaw Park. Now, South Africa didn't really play rugby league. They had a few former rugby players who'd gone to Britain and tried to make some money at the end of their careers playing rugby league, but really there was about 50 rugby league players in the whole of South Africa. So they come over, they toured Australia and got bashed up everywhere, shockingly, to the point where some of their best players had to go home injured, and they called on a couple of South Africans who were playing in Sydney at the time to bolster their ranks. They got to New Zealand. There was serious discussion about whether they'd cancel this trip. They were so bad. But they played, they lost to everybody. Then they got to the test match in Auckland and won 4-3. I think it was the worst day in New Zealand rugby league history.
I'll try and pick out some positives, because there's heaps, as you say, there's many, many great achievements. The 2 all-white soccer campaigns, you've touched on them both. Which the 2 do you think endear the most in history?
Well, definitely the campaign that was the most endearing was 81-82, getting to the World Cup final. That incredible journey they went on to get to the final, finishing by beating China 2-1 in Singapore. So that was amazing. But the Ricky Herbert's team, 2010, that's right, yeah. Their campaign was nothing special. I mean, I think they got through the Solomon Islands. But what they did at the World Cup, not losing, drawing to Italy, not losing a match at the World Cup, that's fantastic. I mean, that stacks up with anything.
And the fact that they're the only unbeaten team, because, of course, Spain won, but they'd already lost in preliminaries.
Yeah. But, I mean, it's sort of lost a bit to me. I think it's better than what it's been given credit for. To go through a World Cup, this is the global game, New Zealand, to go to the World Cup where only the cream are playing, and to not lose a match, I thought that was fantastic. It got to the stage where they were only a goal away from going to the next round.
All right, talk about the few people who've come up numerous times, and Sir Richard Headley just shows his place in New Zealand cricket. I think 3 mentions at least, and he's instrumental in them all.
Yeah, he's pretty pivotal. I mean, he was very dominant in 1978 when New Zealand beat England at the Basin. He was great when he took, 15 wickets at Brisbane against Australia in 86. He didn't get any wickets when New Zealand beat England at Headingley for the first time they'd won in England, but then he did score a lot of runs. And so he contributed that way as well. So he's a very dominating figure in New Zealand sport, and that's reflected in the book.
On the negative side with cricket, Lou Vincent also mentions it's sort of incongruous to be side by side, but having said that, it's made the headlines.
Yeah, it's hard to know in 20 years' time who will be our most famous cricketer. I have a feeling Lou Vincent will be right up there, maybe with one or two others where the story is still unfolding. But yeah, I mean, Vincent did a few good things in cricket, a century on debut and centuries against pace and spin, a double century against South Africa. But he is going to be famous because he was such a crook. He was a reprehensible cheat. And when they talk about that side of cricket in years to come, Lou Vincent's name is going to be right at the top.
And no matter how the Cairns story unfolds, we don't know the final conclusion yet, it's going to be soured in many people's minds, the memories of what he did.
Definitely. I mean, he's one of the great all-rounders we've produced, but he'll have this huge black mark against his name come what may now.
All right, we'll go back to some positives. Another person who gets regular mentions and should is John Walker.
Yeah, I think, I mean, Snell's mentioned a lot in the book and wasn't he great, but Walker, as I was writing the book, I reflected what an incredible contribution he made, because he's in there 3 times for losing to Bai in that unbelievable final in Christchurch in 1974, and then for breaking 350 for the mile and for winning a gold medal. But he could be in there a lot more as well. 100 sub 4-minute miles. That was another great day in New Zealand sport. He's been involved in so many big moments over that long career. So I think I hope he's not overlooked fractionally. I hope people don't go, oh, Snell was the great runner or whatever, because Walker was phenomenal.
Sir Bob Charles, obviously, he's going to feature. Another one who was, at the peak of his time, was one of the best players in the world. Yeah,
I was watching the Ryder Cup the other day and looking at Mickelson there and some of these left-handers, the good golfers now, Bubba Watson, they play left-handed and they're bringing another dimension to the game. They can do different things. But let's not forget, for 40 years, Bob Charles was the only left-hander who had ever won a major. He held the New Zealand flag aloft and was a really special player.
And came back here regularly too to play. He doesn't just drift to the other side. And it wasn't easy in those days.
No, I guess he was a bit like Susan Devoy in a way. I mean, they did a lot of great things on the other side of the world, but they kept coming back to New Zealand, and so they maintained touch with their fans here. Whereas other people, if you pick Ross Norman, another squash player, or even Scott Dixon, they're doing great things overseas, but they're not back here very much, just circumstances.
And one person who was back here, and to his credit, was Ollie Perrin, of course, another one that's perhaps forgotten because of the state of New Zealand tennis at the moment.
Yeah, we wouldn't mind a player now that reached the Wimbledon quarterfinals 3 times and made the quarterfinals of every Grand Slam, won a doubles Grand Slam. We wouldn't mind that. He's in the book for another thing, for the time when he defied the ATP and played in a Davis Cup match in Auckland, come what may, even though he was fined for doing it because he was committed elsewhere, but he wanted to play in this Davis Cup match against Australia, the first one. And so he came out with that famous quote about for king and for country, as it was, you had to do it. And I thought that was summed up Ollie perfectly.
A favourite story, a story that you perhaps came across that you didn't know much about before?
Oh no, that's like saying which is your favourite kid, Tom. I do like the story of this 4'11" fellow, Joe Scott from Dunedin, who was our first ever world champion, 1888. He won a world walking title in Britain. It's just amazing to me. This guy was so short, and you see photos of him up against 6'2" people. Yeah, and he's outstriding them, and he was a phenomenon. When he came back to New Zealand after winning the world title, Dunedin stopped, the waterfront stopped, and he was given a mayoral reception to beat all mayoral receptions and so on. Of course, he ended his life destitute, but selling all his trophies and so on. But his triumph was amazing.